3 months. That is how long it burned. And in 1193, someone burned it to the ground. It took 3 months for the fires to finally die out. At a time when universities were only beginning to appear in Europe, India already had one with 10,000 students. It had 9-story libraries. It had an 80% rejection rate. Scholars came from China, Korea, Japan, Persia, and Tibet. It was called Nalanda, and for 7 centuries it was the center of the intellectual world. Around 427 CE, Emperor Kumaragupta I founded Nalanda in the Magadha regions of what is now Bihar, India. The Gupta Empire, the civilization that gave the world Aryabhata, Kalidasa, and the concept of zero, also built one of the world's first great residential universities. Emperor Harsha of the Vardhana dynasty later expanded Nalanda in the 7th century. He exempted more than 100 villages from taxation, directing their revenue entirely toward the university. This was not a small monastery. This was a state-supported center of learning operating at a scale the world had never seen before. At its peak, Nalanda housed more than 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. Scholars arrived from China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Persia, and beyond. For 7 centuries, Nalanda flourished. And then, in a single year, it disappeared. Entry to Nalanda was not guaranteed. Applicants were examined by a Dwara Pandita, a gate scholar whose job was to test every student before allowing them inside. Historical accounts suggest only 2 out of 10 applicants passed. Nearly every major field of knowledge known in the ancient world was studied here. Theology, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, logic, grammar, linguistics, fine arts. Imagine walking through a campus where one hall debated the nature of reality, another calculated the motion of planets, and another practiced surgical techniques. Debate was central to Nalanda's intellectual life. Scholarly arguments could last for days. Winning a debate brought prestige. Losing one meant public humiliation. The university library, Dharma Gunja, the treasury of truth, was housed in 3 great buildings: Ratna Sagara, Ratnodadhi, and Ratna Ranjaka. Historical accounts describe some of these structures rising multiple stories high and containing priceless manuscripts collected over centuries. Imagine you are a student at Nalanda. You wake before sunrise, not because someone forced you to, because everyone else is already awake. A bell echoes across the campus. You carry your bathing sheet to one of the university's 10 great pools. Around you, 1,000 scholars doing the same thing. After bathing comes meditation. After meditation comes your teacher. You sit in a hall with 300 other students and listen to a master of philosophy dismantle an argument you thought was perfect yesterday. At midday, the university feeds you. It has fed you every day since you arrived. It will feed you until you leave. You have never paid for a single meal. In the afternoon, you copy manuscripts. You prepare your argument for tomorrow's debate. You know if you lose, everyone will watch. This was not a school. This was a life. And 10,000 people were living it at the same time. One of Nalanda's most famous students was the Chinese monk Xuanzang. In 629 CE, he left China and began an extraordinary journey across deserts and mountains to reach India. The journey took years. When he finally arrived at Nalanda, he studied under the great scholar Silabhadra for more than 5 years. When Xuanzang returned to China, he carried with him 657 Buddhist texts, so many manuscripts that they required 20 horses to transport. He had traveled thousands of miles for knowledge and returned carrying an entire civilization's intellectual heritage. Another Chinese monk, Yijing, also studied here for nearly a decade, documenting the rhythms of life inside Nalanda. These accounts, written by foreign scholars centuries apart, describe the same thing. Nalanda was the greatest center of learning in the world. Nalanda was not only a university, it was a factory of ideas that shaped Asian civilization. Philosopher Nagarjuna helped develop the Madhyamaka school of Buddhist thought. Dignaga advanced the study of logic and epistemology. Dharmakirti refined those ideas and influenced philosophical traditions across Tibet, China, and Japan. And mathematician Aryabhata, whose work calculated the value of pi and proposed that the earth rotates on its axis, is believed to have been associated with this intellectual environment. Even today, the Dalai Lama describes Tibetan Buddhism as emerging from the philosophical lineage of Nalanda. In the year 1193, the Turkic military commander Bakhtiyar Khilji led a campaign across northern India. When his forces reached Bihar, Nalanda stood directly in their path. What happened next was catastrophic. The monasteries were attacked, the monks were killed, the buildings were destroyed, and then the library was set on fire. Thousands of manuscripts written across centuries began turning into smoke. The fires burned for 3 months. Centuries of mathematics, centuries of astronomy, centuries of medicine, centuries of philosophy, gone. But the story did not end there. 40 years later, a Tibetan monk named Dharmasvaman visited the ruins of Nalanda. Most of the monasteries had been destroyed, but in the middle of the ruins he found a 90-year-old scholar named Rahula Shribhadra, the last great teacher of Nalanda, still teaching. 70 students still sat before him. The university was gone, the buildings were ruins, and a 90-year-old man rang the bell the next morning anyway. We do not know exactly what was lost in the fires of 1193, but fragments of Nalanda's knowledge survived. We know mathematics was taught here. We know astronomy flourished here. We know medicine was practiced here, because pieces of this knowledge survived in Tibet and China. When Nalanda fell, many monks fled north carrying manuscripts with them. For centuries, Tibetan monasteries had been copying Nalanda's texts. Because of this preparation, parts of Nalanda's intellectual legacy survived, preserved in a foreign language, in distant monasteries. Some of those manuscripts have only been translated in recent decades. Nalanda's knowledge is still being rediscovered today. Ideas born at Nalanda traveled across Asia. Buddhist philosophy taught there shaped the spiritual traditions of hundreds of millions of people. The logical frameworks of Dignaga and Dharmakirti remain central to Tibetan philosophical education even today. Japanese Buddhist traditions trace intellectual roots back through Chinese scholars who once studied at Nalanda. Ideas born in Nalanda traveled farther than the university itself ever could. In 2010, the Indian Parliament passed the Nalanda University Act to revive the institution. The modern university welcomed its first students in 2014. And in 2024, the permanent campus near the ancient site was inaugurated in Rajgir, Bihar. The ruins of the original Nalanda are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Even today, much of the ancient complex remains unexcavated. We are still discovering what Nalanda once was. Civilizations are not remembered for the wars they fight. They are remembered for the knowledge they create. For more than 7 centuries, Nalanda stood as one of humanity's greatest centers of learning. Scholars from across the known world gathered there to study, to debate, and to preserve knowledge. Then in a single violent moment, much of that knowledge vanished. Yet its ideas traveled across continents and centuries. The ruins of Nalanda still stand in Bihar. If you ever walk among those bricks, the same bricks walked by scholars for 700 years, you begin to understand what the world lost there. Nalanda deserves to be remembered as more than a name. If this story moved you, share it, not for the algorithm, for Nalanda. Subscribe to Indus Revealed. There are more stories like this one. Stories that were always true, just never told.